Hello everyone, I'm Silvia from Fairlighttarot Tarot. Welcome to my channel. So today I thought it would have been fun to do a video that looks at the latest trends in tarot and oracle decks. But this is just for fun. I mean, I haven't actually done any specific research. It's just a feeling that I have, and talking about tarot decks and the latest trends with other tarot aficionados here in Australia, in the US, and back in Europe, we do feel like we share some kind of feeling that there may be a bit of a direction looking backwards, looking at the 90s in specific. And all of us, so all of my friends I talk about tarot with are all more or less my age. So we are in, we were in our late teenage years in the 90s, and we turned 20 in the 90s. And so we share that kind of fantastic love for the 90s, because obviously those were the years in which everything was fun, everything was bright, and everything was in specific very, very colorful. And we really loved living in those years and being able to you go out with your friends, and maybe you go on holiday with your friends for the first time ever. And so obviously the 90s for us, for my generation, were very important. There were so many things that were happening at the same time. In specific for me, I actually spent the latest part of the 90s in London, because I started studying uni there. So obviously I was in the middle of this major change that was happening in London in specific, and in the UK in general. But I had lots of friends in the US, and they were telling me that there was these magical things, these really strong epochal changes that were taking place in the US as well. And looking back, I think that for us at least, those were probably the last years in which we didn't necessarily have to worry about some of the things we do worry about now. Those were the last years in which we control technology, as opposed to technology being controlling us, if you know what I mean. And I just refer to the fact that not just literally in the sense that in many cases with AI taking place pretty much everywhere now, not just in artistic production, but pretty much in any kind of production, whether it's business related or art related. From that we can actually gauge the sentiment of the time. So right now we're actually worried about being controlled by technology. I don't know if you watched the latest announcement by Apple. There is a new product which is called Apple Vision Pro, and they're basically these goggles, which are nothing new in the sense that we've seen goggles for playing games, for example, video games before. But these are actually quite revolutionary in the sense that you have these goggles, you wear these goggles, and you don't need to sync them to your phone or your watch or your computer, because everything is in the goggles themselves. They actually have a processor, and you do all sorts of things with AR and VR. And so it is scary. I understand that absolutely 100%. And so there is some kind of nostalgia towards the 90s, because as I said before, it was the last decade in which we actually controlled technology, and it was the beginning of internet, and there were search engines were just all you could get. You just went to a search engine and then you started traveling from that, but there were not that many websites existing as yet. And when you look at many other things, there was a kind of fashion that was kind of making a statement after the big and bold from the 80s and going towards something more refined. But if you had asked me back then in the 90s, I would have said that the 90s fashion were absolutely sober. And now we look back at the 90s thinking that it was also big and bold, and those pants, those jeans, for example. So now there is some kind of looking back and nostalgia referred to those times, and we feel like we want to go back there because there's so much uncertainty right now in the world that it's always a bit of a Six of Cups situation, if you know what I mean. So we look back at those times in which there were not as many worries that we have now, and you know, we were young and free, and we could pretty much read anything we wanted. And I remember back then Ian Banks' Complicity. Every single person you met on the underground in London was reading Complicity by Ian Banks. And it was so much fun, and I really, really loved being alive, being there, being, you know, at the end of my teenager year and in the beginning of my 20s in the 90s, because I really do consider myself lucky because I was able to enjoy them as much as I could. And I thought that if we have a look, a very passionate look, and probably very biased in the sense that it is directed. So what I did was actually look at the latest tarot decks that came into my collection and select the ones that I think actually bring back that sense of the 90s. We can actually come up with a list, and that's what I've done, and that's what I want to show you. So please bear in mind that this is not a research that I've done, and I might be completely wrong, but it's meant, you know, to cheer you up if you, like me, think of the 90s like those years in which I could actually go out, you know, and celebrate life and enjoy life without actually having to worry too much about things. Let's have a look at what I've come up with. So first and foremost, I want to talk about Banksy. Banksy is a super ultra famous right now, and it did start in the 80s, not the 90s. But if you were paying attention to the art movement in the 90s, it was all about Banksy. Why? Because he was the rebel. He was the one that was actually quite confrontational, but he was the kind of artist that symbolized the kind of secrecy of rebellious art, and no one knew his real name, no one actually knew where he lived, where he came from, what were his views, even though, of course, if you look at his paintings and his work of art, obviously you do get an idea. And I think that now it's, I'm sorry to say, but it was back in 2019 or the beginning of 2020, for example, that we in Sydney had an exposition about Banksy's works. And what happened was that they shipped over a bunch of his works from all over the world, and they hang them in a pretty big expo center here in Sydney. And I remember talking with a friend of mine, and she's 15 years older than me, and she really enjoyed Banksy since the 80s as well. And she was quite disappointed because the entry ticket was something like $50 per person. And she was very disappointed because she was saying that that was exactly what Banksy actually stood against. You know, he stood against capitalism, and he stood against that sort of consumerism. We were all led to believe that was what we actually wanted, what we were seeking after. And then, you know, going to one of his expos and having to pay $50 to just have a look at some of his stuff was, you know, a contradiction in terms, because she kept on saying, I'm pretty sure that someone did that against his own will, because he would have never wanted people to pay that much to have a look at his works. Honestly, I don't know. As all of us, you know, as none of us actually do, we don't know him. I think his agent, because he did end up having an agent, his agent is also quite elusive, so it's very, very difficult to understand what his will is about his work of art. But one thing that I remember is that in the 90s, everything was about Banksy and the street art, and what was, you know, that movement of street art that became so famous with him, but actually started before him. And we have many, many artists that at that time became really famous. And if you have been to London, if you are from London, if you lived in London, you'll know the Saatchi Gallery. So the Saatchi Gallery was always displaying work of art from these artists that were kind of at the fringe of societies back then, but obviously they were valued so much once they were, between brackets, discovered, because they were really portraying that kind of society, the kind of people that lived on the margins of society, and they did not want to be part of society. So it was all about rebelling against that. And let me tell you, London in the 90s was fantastic for these kind of things. You could really tell this massive contrast, you know, against the even when you look at the music industry, you had someone like the Pet Shop Boys, which were dressed, you know, in like corporate stooges, you know, they were wearing suits and ties and stuff. And then you had the grunge movement that came from the US, you know, from Nirvana. And obviously there was this bit of a clash, because there were clubs, you know, if you were going clubbing, obviously you wouldn't know him. And that, you know, the place for you, obviously you didn't want to go to a place where you were not dressing the part, whether it was whether the part meant dressing in really fancy clothes or grunge clothes. But so this is the Tarot Banksy. There's a couple of versions of Tarot Banksy. This one is the Major Arcana. I chose this one over the 78 cards because the 78 cards is borderless, but in this case I actually believe that this gives you much more the idea of what Banksy was doing. So because all of these ones are obviously taken from murals, so work of art that he painted over walls pretty much anywhere, especially in the UK, but it's something that it really comes to the surface when you look at the cards. You really are under the impression that you're looking at his work. It's always been like that. It's always been, you know, a great provocation, quite confrontational. And it's always reflected whatever the decade was about, the themes of the decades that he's producing on, and he's still doing it. You know, well, there you go, he's still doing it, you know, showing us that he's always there to back us up, to just show us what really is going on, even though we've been told perhaps something else. I really love his work. It is just absolutely fantastic. I love the fact for the Hangman, there's this kid crying out, and because he's got no comments, no likes, and no new contact or no new followers. So it's something that I really, really appreciate, to be able to see his work in this tarot deck. As I said, it's majors only, but I really do believe that it's a very, very good deck. If you know Banksy and if you remember, you know, the 90s, what were the 90s like? And you will see that this is definitely what the 90s were like for me. It's absolutely an ode, you know, a poem to that decade, because it really does represent the clash of let's say the two classes, even though it's a lot more complicated than that. And as I said at the beginning, this is not meant to be a treaty. This is not meant to be a documentary. I haven't really done any research, and everything that comes, it comes out of my heart and my memories, because I do remember living in the 90s in London and appreciating the fact that I was actually alive at that time of my life. So this is the Major Arcana of the Banksy Tarot. Staying in the realm of the artistic production, there was a lot of use on neon lights and neon colors, in specific what we call fluoro colors. That also originated in the 80s, but it took a whole different meaning in the 90s. I think that whether in the 80s we were all going around with nails painted like this, for example, or with clothes with these kind of colors, or I don't know if you remember, but there were hair scrunchies with yellow fluoro pink and fluoro green and orange and everything. I think that the 90s took that to a whole different level. And what I do appreciate is that, for example, if we look at this tarot deck, it's called the Neon Tarot by Katya Kirtaka. And this has been published by Dark Seneva. I think I've talked about this deck before when I was talking about the artistic production and the value, the product value of this deck, which is, let me be honest, not 100%. It's something that you have to be aware of. However, this deck came very quickly, I heard that there's a lot of people with problems with Dax and Eva, and that depends, I think, mainly on the fact that there's different lead times depending on the fact that if the deck is on stock or not. This one was actually on stock and it only took 3 weeks, which is a normal lead time for me. I mean, I live in Australia, so obviously everything that is not shipping from Australia takes quite a while. This deck, so I was mentioning, it's a very papery kind of deck. I do not think that there's a core in here. However, I do not mind it because it makes it easier to shuffle for me. The colors, however, are very brilliant. It's called the Neon Tarot, and we can see why, because it does have that kind of very brilliant saturated colors with, you know, the very stark contrast between the yellow, the neon yellow, and the reds and the blue. And the result is actually quite striking, as you can see. I love the fact that there's kanjis or Chinese writing on the cards as well. I call them kanji, I know that because I've studied Japanese, so to me they're all kanjis, but I know that it's actually Japanese Chinese characters. So this is a very interesting deck. Once you go past the product value, which is not, as I said, top notch, but you know, you get what you paid for, and I only paid $20 Australian for it, including shipping. So I not only don't complain, I actually cannot complain because it would sound really superficial. I actually really appreciate this deck. I used it a few times for readings, and it's a very beautiful deck. It is rather peepish, as you can tell on the minors, but that doesn't matter. I really do like it a lot. It's one of those decks that you can easily use with any kind of chakra, for example, oracle decks, because of the association with the colors. There's a couple of decks that actually refer to the colors, so like the color oracle or something like that, which will pair up really well with this tarot deck. I don't have those oracles because one of them is indie, and it's actually rather pricey. But it's a very versatile deck, and it's very balanced as well. Like, it doesn't necessarily have a majority of cards being confrontational, and as such more apt for shadow work. I would say that you can use it for any type of readings, and it's a beautiful deck. I like it. I like the art style a lot. So this is the Neon Tarot. And staying again in the theme of neon lights and neon colors, the Neo Moon Tarot by Pixel Occult is quickly becoming one of my favorite tarot decks. This deck is amazing. So as I was explaining in one of my recent videos, I was very lucky to find Crystal from Mona Maya. She's from New Zealand. She's a reseller, and we seem to have very similar tastes, and basically she actually stores Pixel Occult decks on her website. So I reached out to her, and she was happy to send me 3 of these decks for you know, and it's a very reasonable price, because if I had to get them from the US, it would have been more expensive. So I'm really happy that I found them. And this is the type of deck that really reminds me of the 90s. There is that kind of feeling, not just in the use of the neon or fluoro, let's say pink, you know, with this purple and the black, which creates a really nice contrast, but also because there's that kind of style that is now called cyberpunk. So cyberpunk is referring back to the punk movement or the punk style from the 90s, but has been actualized into the basically the 20s, so in these years, because it's uniting, it's combining that sense of rebellion that was brought upon the punk movement in the 90s into this era in which what we can actually see is a rebellion against the machines. So whatever we call cyberpunk is ironically the use of machines and the integration of the machines into our daily lives, and yet some sort of stand up from the human race. Whether it's against the machine or with the machines, then you know, it's a whole different story. But there is this kind of integration in everything we do with the cyber world. So I really appreciate this because it represents for me the kind of natural evolution that I would have seen the 90s going towards for the way in which they were developing and evolving, you know, in that decade. The art style of this deck is absolutely fantastic. I really, really love it. As you can tell, it's a bit dark. And as I said before, it's the kind of dark deck that you don't necessarily want to use when you're blue, when you're down and you need a hug. I would definitely not recommend this deck. However, it is the kind of deck that works really well when you want to do some kind of shadow work, or you want to face that part of yourself that you left in the shadow and you have just discarded, and you want to take it back and just try and process it and decide whether you want to release it forever, or you know, nourish it if it's something that actually can be completing you. And this deck is absolutely gorgeous to do that kind of work. So this is the Neon Moon Tarot. Another deck that I got from Pixel Occult, still same artist, is the Sinking Wasteland Tarot. This tarot comes in a tin. It's a really beautiful production, absolutely gorgeous cards, and I really, really love the quality. This deck is very iconic, I would say, because it does have, at the same time, it shares that kind of punk feel that we saw in the Neon Moon Tarot. It doesn't have neon colors, as you can tell. It's a very glossy, by the way, super glossy, super catching the light, as you can tell. My ring like, hello. But it's actually very, it's a very nice kind of production in the sense that the gloss brings up the colors. Otherwise, this deck would probably be a bit too dark, at least for me. But it shuffles really well, it finds out really well. And again, it does show you that kind of clashing confrontation between the probably the clothing style of, you know, the preppy. I want to say preppy, but preppy is referring back to the 80s. And with that, I'm referring back to the Pet Shop Boys again. You know, the kind of style that you see yourself just wearing a jacket and, you know, a shirt and a tie. But yet at the other end also, you know, you're ready to embark upon an adventure, and there's a bit of robotica in there as well. There's a bit of occult symbols, and obviously when you come with, for example, the strength card, a card like this, I actually really love this because you can really tell the typical 90s style with the hoodie, but a bit, you know, disheveled, broken in pieces with holes here and there, and leather. I used to actually pair up hoodie and leather, and I always wanted some kind of really big statement print on the back of my hoodies, because I wanted to show that, you know, I was strong. And it was the kind of years in which you wanted to show that you were not scared of anything, that everything was okay with you because you were not impressed. On the one hand, we wanted to show the world that we were not impressed with everything that was going on. We were not scared. You know, okay, yes, I'm gonna take this seriously because I know I know how to survive in the world. You know, when you're 21 and you think you know everything. So I'm just kind of looking back at myself, you know, being turning 20 in London and having my dreadlocks done, and I was going to the Kensington Market and I was reading tarot, and I had this really tiny stall where I had one chair and one small table in Kensington Market, and you know, I was next to myself there was a tattoo shop. And on the other side there was this lady that was actually doing dreadlocks, and so I had dreadlocks done for free because I was actually reading the cards for her and her husband. It was so much fun. But you want, you know, it was the time of your life in which you wanted to show the world that you were strong and you could do anything and you could survive, and whatever was going to happen in the world, you know, you were going to be surviving that. You were going to be the last survivor. But then at the same time you were going out and there were these groups of people wearing, you know, just suits, black suits and white shirts and black ties, and it was the same type of world, and we could coexist, and there were it was actually kind of cool to see that happening. So this is to me, that's a very strong reminder of those years. And it's definitely a very, very beautiful deck. So this is the Sinking Wasteland, also by Pixel Occult. And the last deck that I got, also created by Pixel Occult, is the Lost Hollow. So the Lost Hollow Tarot, this is, I've said a couple of times before in my videos, this edition is now out of print, in the sense that the artist is not going to reprint this particular edition, which is borderless, anymore. It was announced on their Instagram page, I think a couple of months ago, but I'm not sure. The good news is that it will be reprinted, and it will be reprinted with red, like that kind of dark red, similar to this, borders. So if you, it depends on what you like. I mean, I saw the previous edition that had cream color borders, and I really, really loved that edition. I wasn't lucky enough to find a copy, so I got this one, and I really love this one as well, so I'm not complaining. I'm really happy that I have it. But it depends on you. If you prefer the borderless edition, there might still be some retailer resellers in the world. Check out with Crystal from Monomaya, because she might still have some in stock. But if you wait, I think that you'll get the new edition, which will have the dark red borders. So this deck is, as I was saying before, it does express that kind of contrast, that kind of, in many, many cases, that kind of discomfort that we were living back in the 90s, because there was starting to be a very strong chasms, a gap, a distance between our expectations of the world coming out of the 80s and the reality, the harsh reality of the 90s. If you remember, the 80s were all about excessive things. So it was about big and bold and, you know, shoulder pads. I mean, let's talk about shoulder pads, or rather, let's not talk about shoulder pads. But let me tell you, if you are pear-shaped like I am, shoulder pads will save your life. There's no two ways around that. I just loved wearing shoulder pads. And they went on to the 90s as well. As a matter of fact, I think that they became the symbol of the 90s in many ways, because you could not find a blazer without massive shoulder pads. And that was amazing for me, because it looked like I was really skinny. So when at the end of the 90s, in the 2000s, they just dropped the shoulder pads, I was so unhappy. And ironically, it was when I started working in a corporate world, and I wouldn't needed those shoulder pads. But that's okay. Maybe they'll come back. One can only hope. But it was very, very typical. And this deck is amazing. Again, like the Neo Moon Tarot and also the Sinking Wasteland. I would definitely not recommend this deck if not for very specific shadow work, or for very serious, very intense kind of readings. It's a joy to look at, absolutely, but it is kind of very, very strong. It comes across very, very strong. So this is the Lost Hollow Tarot. So this deck came out of a discussion that I had with a few friends over at Instagram. As you can see, you can tell my gear, my filming gear, hello, because it's the Tarot of the Holy Spectrum Infinity Edition, which has a very mirror-like kind of box, magnetic box. I love this deck. It's got all the feels of the 90s for me, in the sense that it's got the kind of art style that reminds me a lot of the 90s, but also the kind of really strong, brilliant, almost neon-like floral style colors that you can see. There's definitely floral colors. The reason why I'm referring to this art style as reminding me of the 90s is because now we look at art, for example, in Instagram. I follow some accounts that are absolutely gorgeous. Their art style is just amazing. And what they do, they kind of just this digital collage in which they have, you know, in the lower part of a photograph, for example, you'll have your car driving down the road, perhaps in the national, what's it called, the Monument Canyon, Monument Valley in the US. and which is absolutely beautiful because of the buttes, the rock formations. And then they replaced the sky with a starry sky, you know what I mean, this kind of art style. And that actually was born in the 90s, believe it or not. It was something that was very common back then, also for many commercials of I don't remember, but soft drinks would have had that kind of atmosphere all the time in the 90s. Chewing gums, for example, soft drinks. Back then, I don't know if you remember, back then it was not illegal to commercialize and to have ads for cigarettes as well. So you would have had that too. So this deck reminds me so much because of the art style. It reminds me because of the colors, you know, the floral color used for the hair. This special edition is more so than others. I do have the first edition second print of the Tarot of the Holy Spectrum, and I really love it because that's the one with the devil with all the sentences around it, like you can't do it, you're not enough, why bother, etc. But I really do appreciate this edition as well because of that feel that it gives me, and the really strong vibrant colors that it's showing. There you go, that's the devil card. So the devil card in the other edition is surrounded by all of these negative vibe kind of sentences like you don't matter, you can't do it, you're not enough, why bother, which is very confrontational. As you can imagine, pulling a card like that, it leads you towards a certain type of work. Obviously you cannot necessarily read it in any other different way. So it is good to have that card, but it's also good to have the card like in this deck, which is free to be interpreted in other ways other than that. I really enjoy this deck. It's absolutely beautiful. It does have the kind of mirror backs as well, and also it is edged in such a way that the silver, the shiny silver, looks like a mirror as well. It's beautiful. It reads really well. I remember seeing it in pretty much any channel, perhaps a couple of months ago, or maybe 6 months ago when it came out, and then all of a sudden it started dropping from the channels because people didn't use it anymore. I kept on using it because I actually really like it. And this, to me, it literally looks like it's a light installation, isn't it? It's like a light installation with you know, the swords on the Ten of Swords, which are probably neon lights sticking out of this shape, which could be a body under the sheets. So this is the Tarot of the Holy Spectrum Infinity Edition. Another deck that I wanted to show you that really reminds me of that prevalent spirit in the 90s is the Star Power Tarot by Zigzag Girl. This deck is one of my favorite. If you watch my channel, you know that this is my travel deck. And I've had, I think, a comment of someone saying it's a very odd deck to, you know, take with you when you're traveling. I have to say, I've taken this deck pretty much to, well, last year I traveled with this deck for at least 3 months. And it's still, the quality is perfect. Okay, it's not even chipped. I mean, yeah, perhaps here and there because I do use it a lot. But it's a fantastic product quality. So that's one reason why I take this deck with me, because I know that no matter how many times I use it and no matter how harshly I use it, you know, I just put it in a bag and maybe I don't take it out for a couple of days, or maybe I do and then I keep on using it and shuffling it and reading it. And in some cases there'll be people shuffling it because they want to read with it, and that makes me really anxious because I don't like other people touching my decks. But you know, if they're friends, that's okay, kind of. So this deck is super busy and I love it because it is the kind of colors palette that reminds me of the 90s. It's the kind of, you know, even clothing that reminds me of the 90s. It's the kind of humor, that kind of humor that is very specific from the 90s, in which there is this general attitude of people saying, I don't care. You know what I mean? We just, you know, I don't care. Whatever happens, we don't care. Yes, we've been told that the world is gonna end. Yes, we've been told that there's wars everywhere. What can we do? We just keep on living our lives, and we just try and do our best. not to fall. You know, it was that kind of feeling, a kind of constant survivor kind of feeling. I know that nowadays you will see there's a lot of programs on TV reflecting that, you know, the classic survival tale. But I can assure you that in the 90s we felt like we were actually living as survivors. And it was the kind of feeling that, you know, if you were surviving, you felt like you were kind of cool, but you were not telling anyone anyway, because you knew that you couldn't bank on it. You couldn't really be sure that, you know, you weren't going to meet your maker sooner or later for one or other reason. I really, really love that the High Priestess, for example, has got a booklet with the number 42 on that. This is a reference because if you know, you know. I'm just gonna say Douglas Adams, but it's absolutely magnificent. It's absolutely fantastic. I love the artwork. I love the colors. I love the fact that it's such a busy deck. I love the fact that it does have that kind of survivor kind of I don't care about your BS kind of attitude. I'm doing my own thing, and you know, and I survive. And the Wheel of Fortune has got the tarot cards in it as well. So it does in a way show you that part of the 90s where there was the imminent sense, you know, you had the idea that something was going to happen, you know, something very soon was going to happen, and we would have been all doomed, but for the time being we were just going on. And that was a feeling of the 90s for me and for many other people. And I know that in many cases there was also the symbol of the grunge culture. I think that grunge took a while longer to come to Europe. Grunge, you know, started in the pretty much in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Obviously, with certain bands. I'm thinking about Nirvana, for example, and that kind of style. So this was to start Power Tarot. But to talk about the grunge movement, I thought, you know, the best tarot deck would be the Grunge Tarot, because it definitely refers to that kind of style that was predominantly to be seen in some music movement. So obviously we're talking Nirvana, you know, the area of Seattle, and I'm thinking also Pearl Jam. Even though obviously Nirvana unfortunately did not have time to evolve, unfortunately, because the very sad demise of Kurt Cobain. But if they had time to evolve, like, you know, subsequently we have seen, for example, Pearl Jam, but we also have seen David Grohl, you know, forming the Foo Fighters. So there has been some kind of evolution from the 90s grunge into some kind of more modern terms of grunge. This is to me referring to the 90s, and it's very from the one hand is very fun to look at because you will recognize the characters. On the other hand, you know, if you were alive and kicking, if you were alive and in your teenager years or your 20s in the 90s, you will definitely recognize even yourself. And I remember I was going to as many concerts as I could because that's just what we used to do all the time. And, you know, and we were taking buses like that, and we were absolutely dressing like that. And I remember wearing, if my tights were not broken, I was actually breaking them because that's what we were used to do. I had a couple of friends that were taggers, so graffiti makers. And, you know, it was a kind of, let me tell you, I was skateboarding. Because that's what you did. And I started skateboarding in the 80s. And I was still skateboarding in the 90s. And there was the kind of idea of self-destruction, which I don't want to go too much in the merit of that because it's a very triggering kind of topic, and I understand that. But there was a lot of that going on in the 90s. This kind of deck is not necessarily my style in the sense that I don't particularly enjoy the color palette. It's a kind of a muted color palette. But I do appreciate the effort. I do appreciate the fact that it does actually reflect an era. in a very, very faithful, I would say, kind of way. And so even just because of that, you know, I really appreciate that. It's the kind of deck that when you really, I really love the fact that there's a lighter here in what looks like a diner or, you know, a bar, because you still used to be able to smoke inside in the 90s, and that was the last decade, because then obviously all the legislation came into effect and you couldn't anymore. So the 90s were, for many, many reasons, they were the last years in which you were still allowed to do some very destructive kind of behavior, but without feeling guilty about it. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. You see again with the ashtray with the cigarettes there. So this deck to me absolutely reflects pretty much in a very faithful way that kind of era. I used to play guitar as well, not electric guitar, I was more of a folksy kind of guitar player, but acoustic, let's put it this way. But it's definitely, this, you know, could have been me in the sense that I was not tagging, so I was not using graffiti, but I did have friends who did that. And I had dreadlocks, as I was saying, and I had pink hair because, you know, that's what you do. And I was reading tarot at Kensington Market, and it was the most amazing years I spent in London, for sure. So this is the Grand Tarot. And now something that I wanted to show you today, because I think that it's very important that we start dealing with what has become, it's becoming very quickly a very common kind of art style, you know, in the production of tarot and oracle decks lately. And I'm talking about AI. So this is called the Cyberpunk, and it's by Shimiltai. And I think that I bought it on Etsy, okay, and I'll just put the link in the description box below. However, it looks like it ships from Turkey, but mine came from the US. I think that it's printed in the US, but don't quote me on that. I actually don't know, because I was speaking to this person, and I don't really know whether it was coming from Turkey or from the US, and it doesn't make any difference at all. So I received this deck probably last week. So I was very conscious of the fact that I was buying a deck with AI art, and I was very curious. So in many cases you see a couple of examples, but they only show you the majors, because in AI, let's say, or at least the examples that I have seen, the minors are very peepish. In my case, I absolutely love this kind of art style. And let me explain. What I love is, I don't know if you know the term neon punk or neural wave. So this is basically the art style that is referred to neon lights in city landscape at night. It's a very specific, I know that it sounds almost like it's too specific to be an art style, but it actually is. And one of my favorite artists is actually a photographer. It's called Liam Wang, and I'm going to show you one of his books later. This to me looks very similar to his photographs. And I was very curious about this deck. It's called the Cyberpunk deck. There's another Cyberpunk deck that is actually referred back to the Cyberpunk 2077, which is a video game. By the way, I was going to show you that video game as well, but I'm going to show you a different one instead that reminds me a lot about neon punk. And the reason why, first of all, is because Cyberpunk 2077, if you play with my PS4, I have a normal PS4, not a PS4 Pro, and therefore there's a lot of glitches. Like a lot of glitches, and it's kind of annoying. Oh, look at this one, it's just fantastic. And so I'm going to show you a different game, which is very interesting. So I really enjoyed this deck, and I looked at a couple of the minors and I thought to myself, they're not pippish, they're actually illustrated. Whether it's the right kind of illustration or not, I don't know whether, because in this case, this 4 of Cups to me looks more like an 8 of Cups because it's leaving. But regardless of that, they are actually illustrated. This 7 of Cups, for example, it's a very WS based illustration of the 7 of Cups. And the 8 of Cups again, someone leaving. You see some kind of a rainbow in the 10 of Cups. So I really love this deck. I talked about my point of view on AI in more than one video. What I generally say is that I do not know enough. I worked in the video industry, in the documentary industry here in Australia for many years. I've been working as a photographer and a video producer for many, many years. As such, I have had access to software that was actually manipulating the output, so whether it was a photo or a video. And in many, many cases, I even created my own presets. Presets is a number of actions that you take, or edits, let's say, that you take, and you put them all under one name. You can group them all together, for example, and you call them, I don't know, nighttime, something like that, because in that particular case, for example, you give the feel of a nighttime into your photo. So you take another raw photo and you use the same preset nighttime, and that photo immediately will automatically have all of those edits that you applied before that will be applied to the new photo, and the outcome will be similar to the one you had before. That's called a preset. Now, when you do the preset, you choose the edits and everything, it is your own IP, your own intellectual property. However, there's a lot of software that even back in the 90s, and I can assure you 1000%, had already presets. Photoshop and Lightroom had presets, still do. And those presets were definitely, let's say, created by an algorithm. They were not created by a human person. So what happens is that obviously the algorithm was initiated by a human person, but what happened afterwards was that the algorithm started learning how to reproduce those editing techniques. So now I understand the debate, because there's a lot of animosity around AI, whether it can be called art or not. And I don't want to take part in that, in the sense that, as I said before, I do not know enough. What I'm doing is I'm actually reading a lot of stuff. I'm reading a lot of legislation which is now being discussed in the European Parliament in regards to production, artistic production of AI, whether whether it will be accepted or not and become law or not. We don't know yet, because it started back in 2018, so obviously it's taking its time. But what I do know by reading, and everyone agrees on that, is whenever there is an artistic production and there has been a use of AI, it will have to be specified. So in your case, I'm a Kickstarter backer. I backed many. Whenever I see, for example, a deck like this that may feel like there is some kind of AI being used, if there is AI being used, the creator will have to specify that by law on the description of the deck. Something that is still not law, so you don't necessarily see that. Okay, so I believe that once we get that done, once we get that legislated, we'll have the possibility to actually have a better look at something that is becoming more and more popular. And I can tell you this because right now I'm not able to distinguish. And you will tell me, oh, come on, of course you can. Yes, of course I can. This one, yes. But I can assure you there's a lot of production with the use of AI that looks up, it doesn't look like AI, okay? Not what we are used to. So if they will have some kind of caption saying produced with the help of AI or whatever that would be, it will give us the possibility to actually have an opinion, to actually form an opinion, because right now, honestly, I don't know. So this is, and I wanted to show you this deck because the production value is exceptional. The colors are absolutely brilliant. The cardstock is phenomenal. It's my favorite one. It's battery. It's very durable, but it's also very bendy. I love it. I love this deck. It didn't come edged, but I think about edging it probably. I don't know. I'm not sure. Perhaps. And I am very conscious of the fact that I paid someone who used the computer to generate art. And so be it. It is my choice. Doesn't mean that I will always buy AI art. Perhaps one day when I will form an opinion, I will stop. Or maybe I will continue. I don't know yet. So, but I'm very interested to hear what you think about it because you know, it's always very interesting. It's we are all tarot aficionados and collectors and readers, and as such we obviously train our eyes to judge an artistic production. Can we consider this an artistic production or not? What are the criteria for which we can actually consider this artistic? So it's a very interesting conversation, I think. So this was the Cyberpunk AI Tarot. So those were all the decks that reminded me of the 90s from one reason or the other. There was another one, and I've been waiting for so long for that deck. And when I received it, I was extremely disappointed because it was a fake and I had no idea. So it was the Friends Tarot. So if you know, Friends was a TV show that aired in the 90s, and it was I think it was the show of the 90s. Okay, because it just had all of the values of the 90s, all of the ethics, all of the possibilities, all the fact that if you were that age in the 90s, I was younger than the protagonist of the show, but I kind of looked up to them as if they were older brothers and sisters to me. And then, as a matter of fact, in the year 2000, I found myself in a very similar situation in which I was living with a friend of mine who, by the way, reads tarot, and across the street from another friend of mine. And so for us, you know, we felt like we were living in the sitcom in Friends. And so I found this deck on eBay, and I knew that there were a lot of fakes going around, and I emailed the shop owner and said, can you please assure me that this is the you know, the real deal, it's not a fake? And I have to say, they were a bit shifty. Like, they didn't necessarily say, yes, this is the real deal, but they say something very similar, something like, yeah, don't worry. And I was like, well, okay, I'm not really, I didn't feel like I was assured 100%, and I spent a fair bit of money, so it wasn't the typical $15 one that you know that they're fake. I actually spent a fair bit of money on that one, and then when I received it, it was a fake because it was in a tuck box. And I don't know if you have the original, but the original Friends Tarot opens up like a packet of cigarette. So obviously that wasn't the original one, so I couldn't show it to you. I'm so sorry. And now I initiated the return because I said, look, I even asked you if that was the original one, and you kind of said that it was. But so that would have been the last tarot deck that I would have shown you today. That would have been fantastic to show you, the idea of the 90s. But let me show you the book Tokyo by Liang Wang, as I was saying before. So this is the kind of neon punk, neo or neurowave art that I was talking about. Is you know, it's based on that kind of neon lights that you can find at night in some streets, for example, in this case in Tokyo, but you can find it in Osaka. Osaka is a fantastic city for this kind of neon lights as well, and Hong Kong, for example, as well. But I'm thinking even some parts of Sydney at night, whenever you have high-rise and you have a lot of neon lights, this is the kind of effect. And there is also the use in some cases of some kind of filters to give a little bit of a tint to these kind of photos. For example, there's a bit of a purple tint here. But this is a fantastic book. I really appreciate this artist's art style. And art style, it's not an artistic production, but it's a photographic production. Therefore, to me, it is qualifying as artistic. because photo is artistic, unless it's photojournalism, of course, but this is not the case. And it's just absolutely incredible. It refers back to the urban legend that we were seeing back in the 90s, this way of seeing the city as your own refuge. And it's a city that is almost decadent. It's a city that is almost falling apart, as you can see from the neon sign that are almost falling apart. It's a city where it's almost always raining. And I don't know if you remember The Crow, the movie. For example, one of the most iconic phrases of the movie was "It can't rain all the time," because it was raining all the time. It's just a really fantastic way to it's a fantastic way to have a perspective, a different perspective on the city and on what comes alive at night, for example, thanks to these lights. So this is one of the 2 or 3 books that is published. This one is my favorite one. It's called Tokyo, and I really highly recommend it. If you like this kind of style, photographic style, I highly recommend it. So Liam Wong, Tokyo. And another book that I read, because this is just absolutely fantastic for me. As I said before, I spent the last part of the 90s in London. So to me, London was obviously, it will always be in my heart. Because, you know, I turned 20 and I became the person that I am, more or less, and I listened to that kind of music and I enjoyed it, and I went to clubs, and I was reading cards in Kensington Market, and I had redlocks and stuff like that. And so when I went back to London last year, for example, I saw this book which is called Don't Look Back in Anger, referring to the Oasis song. And it's basically giving you a very honest, I would say very honest idea of what it felt like to live in those years. And it looks at the artistic production, it looks at the music and the cinematic production, it looks at the politics, it looks at, you know, common people like me, for example, and how we were looking at London and how we felt living in London, and what were our concerns, and, you know, the housing problems and the squatting problems and the rave problems, and unfortunately in many cases also the drugs consumption problems. And this is a very honest account, in the sense that it's not adulterated. It's not, oh, it was all so good. Absolutely not. The negative part of the 90s are here, and you know, they don't shy away from pointing the finger at possible causes for that. But if you remember, obviously, you know, there would have been very similar movements in other countries as well, but even sports were extremely important in the 90s. In the 90s, we all started really loving soccer, for example, in Europe. And it could have been a different sport in other countries, but it's when, because of the European and worldwide diffusion of matches, you can actually enjoy watching matches from different places, different parts of the planet, and it was a different way of enjoying that. And obviously with the year 2000, then we could watch them on internet, and nowadays it actually is something that we take for granted. I remember during the pandemic I was watching there was one championship that still kept on going. I don't remember, I think it was in Azerbaijan, I don't remember where, but there was one soccer championship that kept on going, and we were all watching it because there was nothing else sports-wise on TV. And that was kind of normal for us. But imagine back in the 90s, obviously you can only watch your own country. So it was something that was becoming more and more important. Now, one last thing, as I was saying before, it's about the video game Stray. So Stray is the story of this really super duper cute cat who is out there on its own, poor thing, and is saving the world. And it's something that I saw it playing on Jacksepticeye's channel. And when I saw him playing that, I knew I had to play that as well, and I was really happy. It's from last year, so normally I play games from 5-6 years ago, but this one is actually quite recent for me. So it came out only last year. And it's a super cute but really intense kind of game, and it does tend to have that kind of neon light kind of art style, which and cyberpunk style, which I really like. And so if you don't know that game, if you're a gamer, I don't know if you enjoy playing games, that's actually a, let's say, not a shooting game, so you don't require aim assist or stuff like that. For example, in my case, I always use the controller, so I'm really bad at shooting because I have poor aim. So it's not that difficult to play. But it's a very beautiful game, very emotional as well, very emotional, especially if you have a fur baby like I do. And I really loved that game. So thank you so much, everyone, to stay with me till the end of this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It is really wonderful to me to have this relationship with the community and creating this meaningful connections, because it's something that really motivates me, and that was the reason why I created this channel, and it's the reason why I'm staying on YouTube and I keep on producing videos, because of the way in which I can interact with you guys, which are absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for your support. More to come. Have a great day.